Well, aloha everyone, and welcome back to Human Nutrition here at Chaminade University. Today we will be going over Unit 13, namely Food Safety, Technology, and Availability. We'll be talking about different types of foodborne infections. We'll be talking about the difference between foodborne infections and foodborne intoxication, and we'll give you an example of each of those and several different types of foodborne infections. We'll discuss strategies that you can take to prevent getting sick from foodborne illnesses in your own home or when you're traveling about the country or more recently locally due to COVID. We'll describe the food supply in the United States and how it's protected, as well as comparing the risks and benefits of particular food additives and hormones and antibiotics and pesticides in both the food that's grown traditionally and food that is now raised or farmed organically. We will talk about what constitutes sustainability in our food system and talk about different types of biotechnology and how it's used in our current food system and how that has particular risks and benefits. But first, let's get some jargon out of the way. So, food safety is basically going to be any guideline or procedure that helps to prevent contamination and helps to ensure that food that you take home is safe to eat. And this is to prevent foodborne illnesses in our food supply, as an unsafe food supply can help spread pathogens. Foodborne illness is defined as a sickness that's caused by pathogens by consuming pathogen-containing foods or beverages. It can also be known as food poisoning, so you've probably heard of it before as food poisoning, and we know that this can make us very, very sick. Foodborne infection is generally going to be caused by consuming any type of food or beverage material that's been contaminated with pathogens, some sort of disease-causing organisms. Now, pathogens can include anything in the major categories of virus, bacteria, molds, or parasites. Now, foodborne intoxication occurs when you eat foods that are contaminated with toxins as opposed to, say, pathogens. And some toxins are found naturally in certain plants or certain seafood. Sometimes they're produced by different types of harmful bacteria. You may recognize this one as it is the botulinum, which is what creates one of the different types of chemical compounds that is known as Botox. We also have Staph aureus and Bacillus cereus. All of these can cause byproducts that can cause you to get very sick when you eat food that has been contaminated by these toxins. Foodborne intoxication can also occur as a result of chemical contamination. However, viruses and parasites are not going to cause foodborne contamination or foodborne intoxication, as they are actually going to cause foodborne infection. Okay, just to clarify the difference between the two. Symptoms of foodborne intoxication can mimic that, however. They are generally going to include nausea and vomiting. Sometimes the onset can be almost immediate. If you've ever had bad seafood, you know that you can become incredibly ill incredibly quickly. And this is why we have very strict safety guidelines to help us prevent different types of exposure or transmission. Now, some ways that we can be exposed or have transmission of these parasites or microbes can include fecal to oral, which generally results if you have bad hand washing techniques or other improper hygiene techniques. Also, if you eat raw or undercooked meats, poultry, or fish. Now, we here in Hawaii do eat raw fish quite often, but there's a time limit on how long that fish can be out and at what temperature. Now, that's because we have what's called an incubation period. Now, the incubation period is known as the time the pathogen exists in the body before the illness begins. And so we can have this in our body for a short while, and then we can end up getting sick a little bit later. And depending on what type of pathogen we consume, this can determine the onset of our illness, which can range in time from a few hours to a few weeks. And so this is why we want to make sure that we limit how long food is out at certain temperatures, that it's either above a certain temperature where it will kill all the bacteria, i.e. it's hot food, or it's refrigerated and below a certain temperature the bacteria can grow. If it's in that unsafe zone, it can only be there for a short period of time. All right, so most of the common foodborne infections are caused by several different types of viruses and bacteria. You may have heard of several of these. Salmonella is probably something pretty common. I think everybody at some point has had a salmonella infection if they've eaten undercooked poultry, for example. It also can occur on eggs if you don't wash the outside of your eggs. Sometimes you can get some salmonella from the outside that can go into the eggs, and especially if you undercook or don't cook the eggs, use a raw egg for something. This is why you're not supposed to eat raw cookie dough. We also have noroviruses and Staphylococcus aureus, which is a bacteria that does produce a toxin as well that can cause infection, or it can also cause a foodborne toxicity. Other types of viruses, other types of pathogens include viruses, and a virus is a specific type of organism that's able to infect a host and replicate itself. This then causes an illness in the individual as this host individual cells are dying off, as it's simply now serving as they're serving as basically a vehicle for multiple different viral proteins and et cetera to be created inside the cell. Um, Now, viruses are not considered alive themselves because they have to have a host that is going to assist them in reproduction and survival. So they must have a living host in order to survive. However, they can lie dormant for a very long period of time. In fact, the crop conditions, they can lie dormant for years, even decades. Now, the host that a virus takes over can either be a plant or an animal species. And when a contaminated food item is eaten, either by the plant or by the animal, the virus can invade the cells. In an animal, it's going to invade the stomach and intestinal walls. Now, the virus can cause the genetic material in the cell to start, it basically hijacks the genetic material inside the cell, basically tells it to start producing more and more viruses instead of doing any of the things that the cell's normally doing. So the cell's machinery is no longer making cellular proteins or doing any cellular functions. Instead, it's serving simply to create more and more virus, which ultimately makes the individual very, very sick. We can also have a bacterial infection. So bacteria are another type of pathogen. Bacteria are prokaryotic organisms. That means they're single-celled microorganisms. They do not have a nucleus, but they reproduce extraordinarily quickly, on the order of doubling times about every 2 hours. They can flourish on living and non-living surfaces. And some bacteria can live symbiotically with the humans. That means that not all bacteria does cause a disease state. Some of the bacteria are going to live very effectively within the human body. However, bacteria that do cause disease in humans can make you very, very sick. Now, bacteria also love to eat food, particularly food that's on the process of rotting. Typically, it's rotting because the bacteria are in the process of consuming it. So bacteria can cause food to spoil quickly, causing deterioration of the food quality. So you're not necessarily going to be able to determine if food is going to have bacteria present on it just because it looks good. Remember, if we have a doubling time of about 2 hours, just because it looks good doesn't mean that it's necessarily healthy. So it's not safe to just eat food merely because it looks good or it smells good. This is why we have to strictly adhere to the guidelines on the Food Safety Administration for how many hours a food can be at a certain temperature range. Bacteria are able to be found on a lot of different food, including raw meat, poultry, fish, eggs, and produce, also on any ready-to-eat foods and dairy products. Now, one of the major pathogens, again, bacteria, is Salmonella is a particular type of bacteria, and this causes the largest number of illnesses in the United States. This typically is found in the intestinal tract of animals and also in the feces and eggs of animals. And if we accidentally consume something that hasn't been decontaminated, that has Salmonella on it, it can cause severe abdominal cramping, diarrhea, and fever within the first half of a day to several days later. So Salmonella can be something that can be particularly troublesome, particularly if this diarrhea goes unchecked, because it can cause severe dehydration in the individuals, which in the old days could lead to death. Now this one, speaking of death, is a particularly nasty E. coli. So E. coli are normally going to be just fine in your in your gut, but this particular one, the strain O157H7, causes what's called hemolytic, which already sounds terrible, right? Lysis of your blood cells. Hemolytic uremic syndrome, which is going to not only damage the blood cells, but also damages the kidneys, right? You've heard of uri and urethra and ureter. So this is going to be very bad for individuals who can get infected by it. Now, while bacteria typically are going to live in the gastrointestinal tract, it says healthy cows, but it can also be found in humans, right? Bacteria live in the gastrointestinal tract of mammals and are able to be destroyed by heat. But we want to make sure that we're cooking things like beef, etc., way above the limit where we're going to kill these bacteria, because if we happen to have O157H7, which seems to be fine in cow gastrointestinal tracts, but doesn't do well or takes over, I guess, is better way of putting it, the human gastrointestinal tract. So you want to make sure that you're cooking your meats high enough to destroy any of this E. coli that might be present. It's found in ground beef. Sometimes found on produce like bagged spinach, unpasteurized juices and sprouts, and also sometimes in contaminated. It can be found in contaminated water. So you want to make sure that the water sources are going to be filtered before you're drinking straight from your rivers and your streams. Other types of pathogens include molds, such as the multicellular fungi. These guys can live on plant or animal matter, and they can cause all sorts of severe reactions, including respiratory problems and allergic reactions. But they're also something that we use in our daily life, particularly in our dietary life. We can make particular cheeses with it. Particularly blue cheese and brie cheese have a common classic. The brie has that moldy skin, and blue cheese has a particular mold that runs through it in veins. It also grows on breads, fruits, vegetables, and cheeses. So we have a lot of different preservatives that we add to help prevent this growth. And we also know that particular molds can cause food intoxication. A specific type of mycotoxin, can cause food intoxication. An example of that is aflatoxin, which can be found on moldy peanuts. And we do know that if you cook or freeze, you can stop the growth of these particular molds, but that's not going to destroy the toxins. The toxins are still going to be present in whatever it is that you're consuming. So you want to pretty much avoid anything that has mold on it altogether, unless it's something that we already know how to utilize in our food sources. Other types of pathogens can include parasites. Parasites are going to be organisms that survive inside the bodies of other organisms. They rely on their host for nourishment, including all of their nutrients. They can be found in food and water and are often transmitted through fecal-oral route. So dogs that eat the poop of other dogs can get worms, for example. Some common types of parasites include Cryptosporidium parvum and Cyclospora chitinensis, which can be found in contaminated food or water sources. Well, you've probably heard of a lot, Giardia lamblia, which is found in water, so in unfiltered streams and lakes. One of the reasons why you always want to make sure that you filter your water. This is also known as Montezuma's revenge. And also Trichotilia spiralis, which is really interesting. It's a little spiral-shaped parasite. It's found in undercooked or raw pork, and it's particularly nasty because it eats on raw flesh. It can eat on the flesh of the host material, right? We also have marine toxins that can be found in fish, so if they can contaminate the fish, which then can cause illness in the individual who consumes the fish if the fish is not properly cooked. So if it's not killed during the cooking process. Some examples of that can include things like tuna and mackerel. And it can end up poisoned by something called scombrotic fish poisoning, which generates large amounts of histamines, causing an allergic reaction, similar to what is caused from an allergic reaction. Now, in large fish, like predatory reef fish, such as barracuda and grouper, these can end up bioaccumulating toxins, such as Ceuthera, when small fish are going to be eaten by the larger fish. So very tiny fish are eaten by smaller fish are eaten by small fish are eaten by medium fish, eventually medium fish are eaten by large fish, where all of these toxins bioaccumulate as they go through these multiple layers. And so if you eat these really large fish, you're at risk for consuming materials that bioaccumulate. Now, shellfish come with their own can of worms, if you will, in that they contain particular neurotoxins, or they can contain particular neurotoxins that can cause what's called shellfish poisoning. It's a paralytic agent that causes the individuals to lose control over their muscles. This is what I was talking about when I was talking about bioaccumulation. So an example here would be a dinoflagellate, which produces particular toxins, and then these toxins are going to be consumed by smaller fish. So we have dinoflagellates, other microscopic organisms that have toxins that are in them. You can see those toxins in red dots. And they're pretty dispersed inside these smaller microscopic organisms. But as small fish eat the dinoflagellates, and then they're going to accumulate in their bodies, and then larger fish consume the smaller fish. Eventually, largest fish are going to get consumed by fishermen, which are going to be sold for human consumption, right? And in those fish, see how these dots are going to be much more closely together, we will have bioaccumulated the toxins, namely the increasing accumulation of biotoxins after being consumed over many trophic levels. Now, there's also toxins that are found in other foods. Plant foods are known to contain toxins. Some of them are going to be contained in small amounts. Some of them are not harmful if you eat them in reasonable portions, but can be harmful in large doses. And others are going to have to be heated. For example, acorns, they don't have to be heated, but they have to go into a stream or something to help leach out the toxins, and then you're able to grind them into a meal. Potatoes have a particular toxin called solanine that can be found on the green skin of potatoes. So you're able to peel the skin of the potato off, and then you're able to throw that skin away, and you're able to eat the potato afterwards. We can also have cyanogenic glycosides, which can cause food poisoning if you eat large amounts of cassava root if it's unprocessed or raw. And we can also find toxins in wild mushrooms. Anybody ever read Babar, right? Babar's grandfather, I believe, dies of a wild mushroom poisoning. So you want to make sure that you're completely cooking any of the food that you're finding, and also that you're consulting any sort of food guides if you're collecting wild food sources like wild mushrooms. Certain things like methyl mercury can also be very bad for an individual. Now, mercury can accumulate from industrial pollution in different streams and oceans and get converted into methyl mercury by its particular bacteria that are found in the water. And it also bioaccumulates Because it's found in lower levels in the fish are then going to be eaten by larger fish and sometimes by shark, etc. So shark, swordfish, king mackerel, and tilefish are known to have high levels of bioaccumulated methylmercury, which is why pregnant women, nursing women, and young children should avoid these fish because these individuals are at high risk for the different exposure to these toxins. All right, again, individuals that are at high risk of foodborne illness include individuals who are very young, very old, pregnant, or with a compromised immune system. Um, so pregnant women have a whole long list of things that they're supposed to avoid, and typically these things are not necessarily going to be avoided because of the risk to the fetus, but they're avoided due to risk of the mother getting infected, such as Listeria. Now you may have heard of Listerine. Charles Lister, I believe, is what. Anyway, Lister is the one that found the bacteria, which is named Listeria, and Listerine attacks Listeria. That's why it's called Listerine. But anyway, Listeria is found on deli meats, and it sits on ready-to-eat foods. And so pregnant women are told to microwave their deli meat before they use it, if they're going to eat it, or to just avoid it altogether. They're also told to avoid soft cheeses, etc. Why? Because these things can harbor microbial growth, and because they have a compromised immune system, they can become extremely sick more easily than normal, healthy adults. Same thing for those with HIV, AIDS, cancer, and diabetes. They already have a compromised immune system, and so they want to try to avoid anything that can make them sick. And this can also be something that's true of older adults who have an immune function decline due to age, and they also have a reduce in gastric acid production. And reduction in gastric acid means that things that they consume might not be killed off by the HCl that's in their stomach, right? Stomach enzyme serves to kill off any bacteria that are ingested, which means those bacteria might make it into the intestines, which can cause sickness, right? So older adults, people who are pregnant or have immunocompromisation or young children are at a higher risk for foodborne illness than normal, healthy adults. So what can you do to prevent foodborne illness in your home and when you travel? So you want to try to minimize the conditions that promote bacterial growth. And this is why the Food Safety Administration, the FSA, has specific requirements for how food is supposed to be handled, particularly food that is served to the public, like, for example, from a catering service or from something like a 7-Eleven or a grocery store. Now, just like we want the nutrients inside the food, bacteria are also going to thrive on nutrient-rich foods. They also thrive in moist environments. They thrive on foods that have normal pH, so pH above 5 or so, headed up to about 8. So bacteria like to thrive in the same conditions, generally the same conditions that we as humans like, right? A normal pH, nice healthy environment that has moisture for us to thrive on and nutrients for us to thrive on. But bacteria also like the temperatures of about 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And here we are again, right in the middle, about 98. So bacteria are going to divide and double every 20 minutes at body temperature. That means that food can't sit out within this range of temperatures for very long without bacterial numbers doubling. You start off with 2, that's fine. The human body and gut can ingest that. 4, okay, probably, all right. 8, maybe. 16, okay, but eventually you get up into the hundreds and the thousands, and then you get up into too high of a level for the human body to be able to safely consume. This is why cooked food must be handled, served, and stored at particular temperatures under proper conditions to help prevent bacterial growth from occurring. What does that mean? All right, so there's the core 4. Means you want to constantly wash your hands and keep your surfaces clean, right? You want to make sure you don't cross-contaminate. You're never going to take a knife or a fork that has just touched raw fish, particularly raw poultry, but raw meat of any kind, and then touch over into any of your vegetables or your milk products or anything that's not going to be cooked. Right? You also want to make sure that after you cook this meat, you don't put it back on the same pan that you previously prepared it in, right? You want to make sure that anything that's ever touched raw fish or poultry is going to end up in the sink and to be washed immediately, not to be left out to be contaminated with other food products. You want to make sure you cook everything to proper temperatures and that you store it either at these higher temperatures that are going to be above bacterial growth, or you chill it at the lower levels. So again, the core 4 include cleaning, combating cross-contamination, cooking, and chilling. So you want to make sure you wash your hands thoroughly and regularly. You want to make sure that I say you're supposed to sing happy birthday, which takes about 20 seconds to a minute for you to sing, using warm soapy water, and always use hand sanitizers and disposable wipes whenever you're unable to wash your hands properly. You particularly want to make sure that you wash your hands after touching anything that might have had raw food on it, raw meat, or also anytime that you use the bathroom. Constantly keep your kitchen clean, your knives, your utensils, countertops, sponges, etc., all constantly washed and clean and dried before put away so that we don't have mold growth. All your fruits and vegetables should be washed and prepared properly before being served to the public for consumption. Again, cross-contamination occurs when food pathogens are going to be crossing from one food item to another. It can happen from food, from utensils or hands that have touched the food, transferred to another food or object, meaning that things like produce should never come in contact with raw meat, particularly raw poultry or fish, during your food preparation. So make sure that you marinate your raw meat in the refrigerator, not at room temperature, and never reuse the marinade unless you've boiled it. So you can reuse it if you're going to put it on the grill or something like that, but never reuse it straight from this jar to be put back over top of cooked meat. Make sure you store raw meat separately from and hopefully below produce and cooked foods, because raw meat can drip on top of, and you want to make sure that you don't have any drippings on your produce or any cooked foods that you intend to eat without reheating. Make sure you sanitize everything in your kitchen, including sponges and cutting boards, etc., before you start cooking. You can do this using ethanol or with a chlorine or bleach solution. And then make sure you use separate cutting boards for your meats and for your vegetables, particularly keeping raw meats separate. Anything that touches raw meats is going to make sure that you are going to wash it separately, thoroughly with hot soapy water after you touch any raw meat, fish, or poultry. Never use a dirty towel to dry clean dishes, because you're going to assume those dishes are clean when then they may have been cross-contaminated. Try to make sure that any towels that do come in contact with raw meat are going to end up going straight into the laundry and not going to be something that you'll be touching later on in the meal. And make sure that you discard any cutting boards that have a ton of cuts and scratches, because those cuts and scratches can be a region for you to be able to have cross-contamination. So make sure that you keep them clean, and if you do note that you see a lot of lines in them, just go ahead and order another one. They're not very expensive. In order to kill your bacteria, you have to make sure that foods are cooked to high temperatures. So here we have cooked to an internal temperature of 160, and this one is cooked to 135. But some people might think that this one is cooked to a lower temperature. You can't use the color of meat as a reliable indicator. You have to use a food thermometer to check for the temperatures, because oftentimes food has been dyed to make it appear to be more red. That's a trick that they'll often use, which means that food that is properly cooked will look red, but sometimes food that is undercooked, right in the middle here, might not necessarily have reached the proper temperature. You might still have a little bit of bacteria surviving. So again, you want to make sure that you use a proper food thermometer, and that you insert that thermometer not just into the outer layer, but into the center, to make sure that you're getting a reading on the middle of, say, your meatloaf or your meatball. Again, bacteria love to live between 40 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This is called the danger zone. So you want to make sure that food that's hot is kept above 140, and food that's cold is kept below 40. No food's supposed to be in this danger zone for longer than 2 hours. So even though it might look like those poo-poo or appetizers are still going to be okay to consume, if they've been out longer than 2 hours and they contain something like meats or something like cheeses, you're going to want to make sure that it's going to be either properly reheated or going to be thrown away. Now, you are able to slow bacterial growth by putting something into the cold temperatures like the refrigerator or the freezer. And you want to make sure that, especially in a setting where you're at a grocery store or something, that you're going to use the first in, first out method of refrigerator storage. That way you're going to make sure that nothing's going to reach expiry before you're consuming it. And when in doubt, always throw it out. It's much better to be safe than sorry. You don't want to end up sick from foodborne contamination, trust me, particularly when you're traveling. So you should add enhanced food safety procedures to reduce the risk of illness while you're traveling. Particularly if you're going to be traveling into third world nations, people visiting countries where proper sanitation is in question can be in high risk of contracting what's called traveler's diarrhea, or that enterotoxigenic E. coli we were talking about, that 0157H7. It's primarily caused by consuming contaminated food, water, or ice. So if you're not familiar with the area, make sure that you're going to consume only bottled beverages, or that you are making sure that you're filtering your water before you're consuming it. And that's the same thing for your ice as well. And take your proper precautions with your food. Make sure it's up at high temperatures or stored in the proper refrigeration conditions. Now, we have something called the Food Safety Initiative, FSI, which is involved in the coordination of multiple government agencies, so that we can come together to provide food that is safe for the public to consume. It can include agencies such as the USDA Food Safety and Inspection Service, Food and Drug Administration, the EPA, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Services, and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Now, these are all going to be responsible for ensuring that we have appropriate labels, for example, that we have safe food. Everything that's not meat, poultry, and eggs falls into the USDA. Other food falls into the Food and Drug Administration. The EPA helps protect you from harmful pesticides as well as protection of the environment from said pesticides, and helps protect against plants and animal pests and disease, and allows us, the animal and plant health inspection allows us to protect against plants and animal pests and disease. And the Center for Disease Control helps us survey foodborne disease so that we can issue a recall if, for example, we've determined that a particular batch of spinach has E. coli in it. So this here shows how food leaves the farm and the steps that it goes through until it reaches the consumer. So this is the farm to table continuum. So in order for the food to maintain levels of safety all the way to get into the consumer, we have to first start with good farming practices. So we want to make sure that we grow, harvest, and store our food in ways that are going to help reduce food safety hazards. We also want to monitor the food at critical control points where during processing we have particular measures that are implemented to make sure that food meets safety guidelines. Then food has to be transported in proper temperatures. That means we usually are going to be using refrigerated food trucks to help reduce the growth of foodborne microbes. And then last but not least, the retail stores are going to have particular food code guidelines, where retail outlets and restaurants and grocery stores are going to be monitoring the food and throwing out anything that is reaching expiry or marking it down to 50% off halfway through the day before or whatnot, in order to reduce the risk of foodborne illness to the consumer. And last but not least, the consumer has to do their part, whereby they follow the 4 C's of food safety, namely making sure everything is clean before starting, keeping cross-contamination at a minimum, cooking everything to the right temperature, and chilling it properly for food storage. Now, there are multiple different techniques that we can use to help reduce the spoilage of food. And we've done many of these techniques way prior to the Food Safety Administration. That includes things like heating our food up to higher levels, canning our food, pickling our food, so we can use brine, or we can also use high salts, drying or freezing our food. Another technique that we use quite often is called pasteurization. Pasteurization was invented by Louis Pasteur. Basically, what we do is we heat the food up to a high level just prior to heating, or just prior to canning, I mean, such that we can kill off the pathogens and then seal it so that no pathogens are introduced. That way we're able to create something that can last for a pretty long time frame, such as canning, right? So if we store food that has already been heated, well, stored in an airtight container and then heated up to 240 to 250, that's way above that 140 range where bacteria like to thrive. And that's going to kill any microorganisms. This is going to be regulated by the FDA and HACCP. We also have mechanisms of modifying the atmosphere in which food is packaged. Oftentimes, food is going to be packaged in low oxygen conditions. And if we package food in low oxygen conditions, then food has a low level of rancidity to help delay spoiling. That's going to help us extend our shelf life. We often use this in packaged fruits and packaged vegetables. We can also use high pressure packaging, or HPP, which we are going to take food and expose it to a series of high pressure pulses. This is used quite often to make jams, fruit juices, and vacuum packed food items. Oftentimes we also irradiate food. We can irradiate it such that we can kill bacteria. This, however, is not going to be sufficient to kill viruses. We do this, we could also use a cold process, where we're not changing the physical characteristics of the food and we're not retaining any of the energy waves that are going to be, so the irradiation is just going to kill off any bacteria. And we have to label food as irradiated food with the Radura symbol. And you'll be able to see this if you go to the grocery store. Typically, you'll see this on things like fruits and vegetables, herbs and spices, fresh meat, pork, poultry, wheat flour, and white potatoes. What's interesting, though, is that irradiated foods typically are going to have the inability for their seeds to be able to plant. This is why things sometimes like peppers that you might get at the grocery store might have a difficult time growing in your garden because the irradiation of the seeds is going to prevent them from sprouting. All right, so moving on. So these are the different types of foods that are going to be approved for irradiation. So it's going to help us to help control insects and control disease-causing microorganisms in things like poultry. Also use it for dry or dehydrated enzyme preparations to help control insect and microorganisms. It's found on meats like beef, lamb, and pork to help control the spoilage rate by eliminating or reducing the amount of disease-causing microorganisms. And it delays the maturation of fruits and vegetables. It's also used on spices and dry vegetable seasonings to help decontaminate and then control insect and microorganisms such that that hamburger helper can remain on your shelf for 2 years without anything growing inside of that seasoning packet. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to these labels. We have labels on both closed and what's called open food products. So open food products is going to be something like your yogurt, for example. Now, closed food products are going to have dating based on coding packing numbers that you see on non-perishable foods right here. We can also find best buy labels on most of our open food products. These typically are going to contain a calendar date along with the information on the how to use the date, right? So you want to make sure Best Buy 1014, etc. And you can see how long this image was stolen off of Google. It's been, goodness gracious, several years now. All right. So we have two methods of food product dating. Again, so some's going to have closed coded dating, which is going to be information used by manufacturers. We can use these for recalls, etc. It's going to allow manufacturers to help keep track of inventory or use for recalls. It's used on generally non-perishable, shelf-stable food items like canned goods. Now, on perishable items like meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy, we use what's called an open dating system, which is more helpful for the consumers, right? The consumer, if they go back one, the consumer doesn't really get much information out of this. Although the manufacturer is able to look that up, and you could probably get that information on Google, this is going to give that information that you might need as the consumer right there in your hand. Namely, what is the sell-by date, right? When is the grocery store expected to toss this item away? Or when is the use-by date, which should be a little bit later, indicating the dates for the quality of the food, how long it can be maintained, for example, in your shelf, in your refrigerator before consumption. All right. So I talked about the EPA and how it was responsible for keeping toxins out of your food supply as well as out of the environment. Now, the EPA is responsible for ensuring your safe water supply as well. And the SDWA, or the Safe Drinking Water Act, is a statute that affords the protection to your water supply. And the EPA also sets these particular standards to maintain a healthy population by protecting the nation's drinking water from unsafe amounts of contaminants. However, these reports are actually left up to the states. So the states are going to have to produce an annual report on their water systems to be able to state whether or not these water systems are meeting these national guidelines. So these reports are collected in a database called the SDWIS, the STWIDIS, or the Safe Drinking Water Information System. All right, so as to address the question concerning food additives, hormones, antibiotics, and pesticides and the role that they play in food production and safety, we're going to first start by discussing food additives. Now, food additives are any item that's added to a food in order to change the quality, freshness, or safety of that item, or something that's added to enrich the nutrients, so fortified foods, for example, or to improve the flavor or the texture. Oftentimes, additives are going to include preservatives, flavor enhancers, and nutrient additives. The most common preservatives are going to include things like salts and sugars. So meat and fish are going to have a ton of salt, or preserved meat and fish can have a ton of salt added to them to cure them. So hot dogs, for example, or lunch meats can have nitrates and nitrites added to them. These are different types of salts that are added to cured meats. And canned or frozen foods or condiments, and often going to be cured with something like sugar. Other common preservatives include things like antioxidants and sulfites. Antioxidants are going to help prevent spoilage by preventing the off taste or off color that's associated with rancidity. So we can get that by adding vitamin E to different oils and cereals. And we can add vitamin C to fruit to help prevent browning. So if anyone's ever ordered those apple slices from McDonald's, for example, you'll see that one of the additives is going to be vitamin C. That's going to help prevent the apples from becoming brown the way they would on your counter. They're also going to be stored in modified packaging that's going to be low oxygen as well to help reduce rancidity. We also have other types of antioxidants like BHA and BHT that are going to be used as preservatives. Sulfites can also help prevent oxidation and limit the growth of microbes on the surface of your food. Some sources of sulfites are going to include things like wine, dried fruits and vegetables, packaged potatoes, beer, and bottled lemon and lime juices, as well as pickled foods. We also will add things to foods that will help improve the nutrient content. Refined grains, for example, can be enriched with things like B vitamins and iron. So anytime you see fortified, that's going to indicate that we've added some sort of nutrients to your food. Additionally, we've added folic acid to grains, and that was imposed by the FDA to help prevent spina bifida, or particular types of neural tube defects that can occur in fetuses of pregnant women who are not meeting their folic acid needs. We can also add things that will help improve the color, such as FD&C, DNC, etc., which are going to be man-made types of certifiable colors like food colorings. We can also find colors from natural sources such as plants, animals, or minerals. Things like saffron, for example, which is found in the crocus, is something that's one of the most highly sought spices because it's something that can directly add can add color as well as flavor to your foods. We also add things that help enhance the flavor, such as MSG or monosodium glutamate, which is going to be found in many things like canned foods, also found oftentimes in Asian foods and processed meats. It's going to be something that we can consume in small amounts, so it's generally going to be considered to be safe when it's consumed in amounts lower than 0.5 grams per meal. But when you consume 3 grams or more at a time, you can end up with MSG symptom complex, which can cause chest pain, numbness, and burning sensation or facial pressure. So if you end up getting toxicity from this, you can end up getting burning sensations or numbness or chest pain. So we want to make sure that you're consuming MSG in small amounts or that you're avoiding it altogether. This shows you the safe storage. This table is going to show you the safe storage time frames for perishable foods, so the storage time that you can be anticipated to be able to keep this food after purchase, whether it's been unopened or opened. And I'm not going to sit here and read this table to you, but if you ever have questions, you can refer to this for reference. Now, before we can add things to our food, we have to receive FDA approval. So before we receive that approval, we have to prove that additives are safe. Now, sometimes we can make exceptions to that. Things that have been previously used forever or prior sanctioned things can be previously identified as safe, or we can also have foods that are generally recognized as safe by the FDA. That something that we've been using for a long period of time, and based on the review of our historical use and research, we can generally assume that these are going to be safe foods. But we also have a clause in the Food Additives Amendment called the Delaney Clause that states that any additive that is proven to be carcinogenic must be taken off of the market. Now, we have different types of food additives. As I just mentioned, we have a ton of different intentional food additives, things that are added to help improve the food quality or improve the shelf life or stability or to improve taste or texture or add nutrient value. But we also have unintentional food additives that can add into food unintentionally during manufacturing or processing. This is why we have to have something in there on their packaging that says also processed in a facility that processes peanuts. Because individuals that are going to have small amounts of peanuts are going to cause toxicity, they need to know that it's possible that small amounts of substances that are used during the processing or packaging of other foods at that same plant, or other chemicals from the processing process, or traces of compounds provided can also be found in those food products. One of the things that can be added in this unintentional method is bovine growth hormone, which is found naturally in cows to help assist in normal growth and development. But we also created a recombinant form of it called recombinant bovine somatotropin, which is a synthetic form of bovine growth hormone that increases the milk production in the cows that receive it. So the review from the FDA states that it's safe. However, the use of it is controversial, and because of this, RBST has declined, or use of RBST has declined in the United States because consumers have a lot of control over supply here in the U.S. Right, you have choice where your dollar goes when you get to the demand side of the supply and demand chain. All right, some other things that can end up unintentionally added to our food supply include antibiotics. Antibiotics are any drug that's designed to destroy bacteria or slow bacterial growth that are often given to treat sick animals or just to prevent disease and promote growth of the livestock. Typically, these are used for a short period of time and are typically taken away from the animals before they're going to be harvested for their meat. But we can end up with antibiotic-resistant bacteria if we have regular and long-term use of these antibiotics. Other things like pesticides can be used in agriculture. This is going to help improve the food production. Pesticides are going to be any chemical that's used to kill or repel pests. Specific types of things can include herbicides, which kill weeds or plants, or insecticides, which kill insects. We have specialty types of insecticides, such as organophosphates, that are used on fruits, nuts, vegetables, corn, and wheat to help kill off any insects so that our plants may thrive. We also can use antimicrobials to kill off microorganisms. This includes any type of disinfectant that you use, or like sanitizers. Anytime you use a hand sanitizer or other type of sanitizer on a surface, those are called antimicrobials. We also have fungicides, which destroy mold, and if you're looking to kill those pesky rodents, you can use a rodenticide. That means that we can have specialty types of chemical compounds that we can use So we can minimize the damage from insects or molds, etc., whatever it is that we're suffering from, to help produce a larger yield of our products. Now, the EPA does play a role in improving pesticides for their use and regulation of how much pesticide is able to be used, as well as establishing acceptable tolerance levels. And the USDA plays a role in regulation of pesticides by enforcing the tolerance levels in meat, poultry, and eggs. And the FDA is going to enforce the tolerance levels for all other foods. So basically, the EPA sets the guidelines and standards, and the USDA and the FDA are going to help regulate them in their respective food products. So the EPA has conducted risk assessment in order to demonstrate that the pesticides are able to be used without harm. And to do that, there's a couple different steps that they have to undergo. The first is they have to identify the hazards. So what are the health problems that the pollutant possibly causes? And then talk about the exposure to those pollutants. So how much of the pollutant do people inhale? And how many people are exposed, as well as what are the different problems at different exposures. So a dose response assessment. If you have a small amount, a medium amount, a large amount, what are the different health problems that can arise at different levels? And then make a overall risk characterization where they can hypothesize the risk of health problems or extrapolate the risk of health problems to the exposed population. So all of the individuals that have been exposed to this pesticide or whatever the chemical is. And that helps us determine our acceptable tolerance level. An acceptable tolerance level is going to be the maximum amount of residue that's allowed in or on the food. And typically we have a safety factor of tenfold that we add to protect vulnerable groups. So if the acceptable tolerance level is actually 1, we're going to say that it's 0.1. That way anybody who has a compromised immune system, etc., or is particularly vulnerable to foodborne illnesses is only going to be exposed to 1/10 of the level that we think is considered acceptable for a normal, healthy individual. However, that doesn't mean that your levels are going to be 0. So when you are going to have food that comes from the grocery store, you want to make sure that you reduce the pesticides found in the food by multiple different ways. The first, you want to make sure that you thoroughly wash and scrub all fresh fruits and vegetables. And this is not to get rid of just the pesticides. We also have something called rat lung disease here in Hawaii that can be very deleterious to an individual's brain. So you want to make sure that you wash all fresh produce before you consume it. Then if you can, you want to peel and trim any fruits and vegetables. So you're going to discard any of the outer leaves or leafy vegetables to help reduce the pesticides that are residual. And for your meat, you want to trim your visible fats and the fatty skins from poultry and fish to help reduce the residue that remains in the fatty tissue of the animal. And you want to make sure that you eat a variety of food. Therefore, you're going to reduce the chance of being overexposed to any particular pesticide because different foods will have different toxins in them. But if you're going to keep a variety in your life, then you'll be exposed to low amounts of lots of toxins instead of high amounts of a particular toxin. All right, some alternatives that we can use to pesticides include IPM, which is an integrated pest management scheme, which allows us to use natural toxins or rotator crops, or choosing strains of plants that are already known to be pest resistant. We can also plant nearby fields with non-food crops to lure the pests to an alternate food source to them. And most of the crops in the U.S. are being grown using some mechanism or combination of both the pesticides and integrated pest management schemes. Now, when we talk about organic in our food supply, this is something that is going to be my soapbox. Organic in food means something completely different than organic means in chemistry. In chemistry, organic means that it is going to have a carbon, a hydrogen, and an oxygen backbone, which can refer to all sorts of chemical compounds, including the pesticides that we use, and then label something inorganic. So in the scheme of being organic versus inorganic, right, or I guess non-organic in terms of our food supply, organic food production is going to involve growing crops without any synthetic compounds, no synthetic pesticides, no synthetic fertilizers, no bioengineering, so no GMOs, and no irradiation. All livestock have to be antibiotic and growth hormone free. However, all of these precautions don't necessarily line up with any scientific research. So we don't have any scientific evidence that demonstrates that completely organic fruits and vegetables are safer or in any way nutritionally superior to conventionally grown food. But we do know that they are more expensive. And a lot of that has to do with the labeling programs, as well as the fact that they often have a higher food loss than organic food and still have to pay the same amount for their land. Now, labeling is going to be regulated by the USDA's National Organic Program. And there's a lot of hoops that these farms are going to have to jump through in order to earn this label. They're going to have to meet National Organic Standards, or NOS, which were developed by the USDA in 2002 to ensure that all foods labeled as organic are actually produced, processed, and certified along the same standards and guidelines, basically to level the playing field. And again, that labeling is strictly regulated by the USDA through the National Organic Program. Now, things that are organically grown and processed don't necessarily mean that they're necessarily pesticide free, because we are able to use different types of biopesticides and synthetic pesticides and still be able to label food as organically grown. So we have different levels of organic. If the label says 100% organic, then we have to meet different parameters than if it says organic, than if it says no organic claims, or made with organic ingredients. 100% organic is obviously more stringent guidelines than being organic. To be organic, it has to be 95% organic or more. To be 100% organic, you're going to have 100% of the food that goes into this product is entirely comprised of organic ingredients, no sulfites, and they have to be certified by an agency and have that USDA organic seal displayed. If the label says made with organic ingredients, that means at least 70% of the ingredients are organic, and if we have no organic claims at all, then the food contains less than 70, potentially down to 0% organic ingredients. All right, so let's talk about food sustainability for a minute. Now, food is considered sustainable if it's going to be able to be created under a method whereby resources are maintained indefinitely because we're not depleting or damaging the resources. We're using all natural resources to produce, transport, and distribute the food. And this is going to help utilize our resources in a much more sustainable way. The way that we currently use our agriculture is industrialized, highly industrialized, and it's going to be using resources at what's considered to be unsustainable rates. So in order for us to have sustainable, resilient, and healthy food and water systems, we have to have overlap from multiple different levels of framework. Namely, we have to have environmental stewardship, we have to have nutritional and health, so we have to have a population that is driven by levels of nutrition and human health in order to assure dietary diversity. And we have to have social, cultural, and ethical capital, whereby the society is going to have empowerment from social responsibility and community engagement, as well as economic vitality, whereby we can build community wealth and have economic viability. All of these four have to overlap in order to create sustainable, resilient, and healthy food and water systems. In order to preserve our natural resources, in order to take steps towards sustainability, the first step is to preserve our natural resources, and we need to do this multiple different ways. So in order to preserve our natural resources, we need biodiversity, we need to maintain energy, and we need to make sure that we negotiate our water supply properly. So in order to maintain biodiversity, we have to have variety of and increased nutritional quality of our food. Energy is broken down into where we get our energy from. So where do we get it from? Mainly are fossil fuels. We use fossil fuels in producing our food, processing our food, transporting our food, and preparing our food. And this can be very costly. And a meat-based diet is far more costly than a plant-based diet in terms of our energy consumption. And in terms of our water usage, we have a huge demand of our water supply based on the increased population, so both for themselves and also for creating that food is going to demand water. Now, locally grown food is going to require few external resources. So if you were going to be able to try to get your food from a local source, then you can help reduce the carbon footprint that that food has. So if we were looking for the average distance in miles by truck to Chicago for particular foods, grapes are going to travel over 2,000 miles to get to Chicago. Broccoli, same thing, about 2,000 miles. Asparagus, 1,500. Apples, 1,500. Sweet corn, squash, and pumpkins, under 1,000. Why is that? Well, there's only a couple of states that supply these things. Only one state actually is going to supply enough grapes to meet to be able to transport across the country. Broccoli, we only have 3 states, asparagus, 5 states. And as we start getting into the states that have more things like corn, for example, we have 16 states. That means we're going to be able to get that closer in order to supply it with less miles driven on the truck. However, it also means we're going to have to subsidize a lot of these different things from Mexico or other countries. So a lot of our produce actually comes not only from far away within the United States, but from far away from outside of the United States. So one of the first things you can do to help reduce your carbon footprint and help reduce and make more sustainability within your environment is to help get your food from locally grown food sources. So that would become what's called a locavore. So becoming a locavore would be someone who eats locally grown food whenever possible. Food that's locally grown, I've heard that it tastes better, but it definitely stimulates the local economy and reduces the use of natural resources in that that food doesn't have to travel 2,000, 5,000 miles to get to your table. Whenever possible, grow your own food or purchase it at local farmers markets to help support community agriculture. Although it is known that we have a limited availability of particular foods throughout the year, so where you're located geographically can help limit the availability. And just because the food's grown locally doesn't necessarily mean that it's grown sustainably, right? Larger farms can still have unsustainable farming practices, but this is going to be a good step in the right direction. In order for you to help ensure that the food that you eat is safe and sustainable, the next thing you want to do is to try to know your food labels. So know the label terms that indicate how foods are produced. Is it certified? If meat is certified, it's been evaluated for class, grade, and quality characteristics. For poultry, is it labeled as fresh poultry or free range, etc.? If it's fresh poultry, it means it's never had an internal temperature below 26 degrees. That means we've never frozen it down into the freezing temperature. Um, Also means that we might have gone below, but we've never had an internal temperature that has gone below 26. We also have the label free range, which means that an animal is allowed access to the outdoors. Now, again, that just means it's allowed access. It doesn't mean that it have to take the access or that it's allowed access 100% of the time. But again, this is a step in the right direction. Now, for those of you with a little bit of religious background, kosher is going to mean that food is prepared under the supervision of a rabbi. And what's really interesting about a lot of these kosher regulations is that the kosher regulations, while very stringent, often align quite nicely with avoiding cross-contamination, making sure your food is properly cooked and managed. So this is the way in which we were able to pass information on about how to properly and safely eat prior to being able to have something like the FDA Make Food Safely guidelines. All right, so let's talk about genetic engineering for a little bit. Genetic engineering doesn't make a food more or less safe. So genetic engineering is a tool that changes the genetics, and depending on what you change, you can make things more or less safe. So it's a way in which we use biotechnology to modify food in the food supply to change the genetic information of particular plants and animals to create food products that are going to be ideal for food consumption. Right? And we can do this with two different levels. Genetic engineering is just a small alteration of the genetic makeup of an organism whereby we manipulate the DNA sequence. We can also have genetically modified organisms, which are GMOs, which have been genetically engineered to contain original or foreign genes. Multiple times these GMOs are going to refer to things like corn and soybeans and cotton. All of the soy and almost all of this corn, soybeans, and cotton are actually genetically engineered varieties. But before you go just say no to GMO, remember that genetically modified organisms are actually going to be helpful in certain third world countries as well. A really strong example of this is going to be golden rice, or rice that has the genes for the creation of vitamin A put into it. Now, vitamin A deficiency is something very common in third world nations where people don't tend to get enough vitamin A in their diet when they're eating strictly just rice, for example. And vitamin A deficiency is associated with blindness, particularly night blindness and pregnancy blindness. So if we're able to introduce vitamin A into a food staple that people in third world nations are going to be eating all the time, we're able to therefore introduce a fortified food product that's going to help stave off vitamin A deficiency in third world nations. So that's one of the most highly lauded GMOs that's actually going to be very beneficial, particularly to people who are in a third world nation who would otherwise not necessarily have access to appropriate nutrition standards. So just because something is genetically modified doesn't necessarily mean that it's a frankenfood, right? Oftentimes the genetic modifications are put there for a purpose, either to add nutritional content or to increase the shelf life of the food or to allow it to have pesticide resistance, etc. So, genetic engineering differs from plant breeding, and the genetic engineering kind of bypasses a lot of the steps. So we've always taken the best and the strongest or the tallest or whatever it is that is the trait that we want to breed into our food product. We've bred that into our meat supplies by breeding larger cows or cows that produce better dairy products or sweeter milk, right? We've bred that into our plants. Just look at the original corn. The original corn was very small, about 2 inches, and it didn't have anywhere near as many kernels on it. It also fell right off. Now we have corn that stays on the cob and is extraordinarily large, right up to a foot in length. And we've done that simply by plant breeding, looking for the largest or crossing different strains of plants that provide what we're looking for. So traditional plant breeding involves crossing two plants of the same species to produce DNA that has more desirable traits. And it was an imprecise mechanism, right? Sometimes you would get things that had less of the desirable traits, and so you'd have to weed those out and crossbreed over multiple generations until you finally got the plants that you liked, that had the right flowers or that had the right seeds or that had the right starch content, etc. With genetic engineering, we can skip that by just taking the desired gene out, isolating that gene, and popping it into the recipient's DNA. So genetic engineering allows scientists to manipulate DNA very precisely from one plant and engineer it into another plant much more quickly. Um, Oftentimes, they'll do this with a soybean base. So, typically, one of the biggest problems that we run into with genetic engineering are individuals who might have a soy allergy. So, people who have a soy allergy might have to be very careful what they eat because they might eat something like a strawberry or some sort of other fruit that they wouldn't expect to have any soy in it at all, but due to the modern miracle of genetic engineering, might have some soybean DNA inside of it. So proponents of genetic engineering will tell you that it produces more and better foods, and it's certainly going to be beneficial for countries that have an inadequate food supply, and that they're going to be able to create more food biomass in smaller areas. To also allow to reduce the amount of pesticides used on food crops, improve the tolerance of crops to herbicides, increase the shelf life and improve nutrient composition. This is going to be very beneficial in third world nations. Improving the nutrient composition mainly so that we can end up getting things that might be deficient in their diet back into their diet by adding it to food that they would normally eat, like golden rice. And this also allows us to create new uses for plants in pharmaceutical arenas, industrial and environmental arenas. However, there are very viable concerns about genetically engineered foods. Now, some people have gone kind of overboard and believe that genetically engineered foods will disrupt the ecosystem. However, that is kind of happening with Monsanto. I'm not sure if you've heard about Monsanto's lawsuits, but Monsanto sells seeds that are not able, so they're able to produce one plant, but those plants are sterile and unable to produce the next set of plants. In that way, farmers are responsible for purchasing these seeds from Monsanto over and over again. And it's been found that sometimes these seeds that come from Monsanto can end up in neighboring crops. And they've even gone so far as to fine farmers who are found to have these Monsanto trademarked plants on their land, even when they are planted there, kind of accidentally. So there are some indications that it's possible that genetically engineered foods could take over or disrupt the ecosystem by making monocultures or providing highly resistant strains, but in general, this isn't really a threat. Neither is the Frankenfood argument, the ethical dilemma created by Frankenfoods. However, the introduction of allergens, as I mentioned, like the soybean allergy, is a very real problem, or certainly for someone who is allergic to soy. And it can also, in this bioarms race, introduce resistant weeds that become more and more resistant as well to the different pesticides and herbicides that are put on these plants. We also have concerns that we simply don't know how this changes what the plant does. Are the plants able to produce more plant toxins or change their nutrient content, etc.? Does that mean that we're going to be producing animal food that might be unsafe? So now we have to have regulation of genetically engineered foods, and they're going to have regulation underneath the same guidance as this we have previously for our regular food, namely the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA. So here's the concerns and regulations of genetically engineered foods, including that we might have a genetic modification that was undesirable, so something that we didn't mean to have. And that means that we have to have a close look at any genes that are used in genetically engineered food prior to using them. So all genes must not have prior evidence of encoding any harmful substance. It also must be stably inserted into the plant, meaning that it's not going to bounce around or cause any rearranging of genetic information that could cause any sort of combination creating an undesirable substance. We also have a concern of introduction of food allergens. And that's under the FDA regulation, such that GE foods must be monitored for those food allergens, and any protein that's encoded from common allergen sources, such as milk, eggs, fish, etc., should be presumed to be allergens and should be labeled as such on the GE food. So it should say on it, this may contain soy protein, even though it doesn't. Or this may contain XYZ protein, even though it doesn't, it's not actually a soy product. And we don't know necessarily if it does, but just as the option that it might cause an allergic reaction. Additionally, concern is that we might have excessive levels of toxins, so we want to make sure that genetically engineered food doesn't have any natural toxins in it at levels that are higher than those found in the natural plant. And the nutrient status has remained unchanged, so we want to make sure that GE food is monitored to make sure that we don't have any unintentional changes in nutrient levels, or that we have any new substances created. So we want to we want to monitor any of these genetically engineered foods to make sure that if the genes are introduced, that these substances are going to undergo new approval by the FDA, as would any other food additive. However, if the substances are already substantially equivalent to food that exists already, they do not need the FDA's pre-market approval. Namely, if this is something that you're already getting from your diet, but you're just getting it from a different plant, we're not going to call it an additive or cause a whole scandal with the FDA. A last concern is a very viable concern that we might create unsafe animal feeds from genetically engineered foods. And that's because almost all animal feed comes from a single plant source as the predominant food source. So all genetically engineered food must meet the same strict safety standards that are in place for food that is grown for human consumption. All right, so is genetically engineered food safe? And the answer is overall yes. Genetically engineered foods are regulated. They're highly regulated by the FDA, USDA, and the EPA, just like all of the rest of the food that comes down your food pipeline. So the FDA helps ensure genetically engineered food is safe to eat and labeled with any allergens they may contain, even if they're just a suspected allergen. The USDA ensures that plants are safe to grow, and the EPA ensures that any gene for pesticide inserted into a plant won't have any adverse environmental effects. At this time, we have over 50 GE foods that are considered safe, or at least just as safe as the conventional counterparts. We have genetically engineered canola oil, corn, cottonseed oil, potatoes, soybeans, squash, and tomatoes. However, at this time, the FDA does not require labeling for genetically engineered foods. However, manufacturers are allowed to voluntarily label their food. All right, so that's going to bring us to the end of our lecture. Thank you so very much for sticking with us today. I appreciate you coming to class, even though it's virtually. So have a fantastic day. Aloha and happy studying.